February 19, 1945. Dawn breaks reluctantly over the sulphurous expanse of Iwo Jima, its black volcanic sand still cool beneath the pale morning light. The air hangs heavy with the acrid smell of sulfur, springs bubbling up from the Earth's bowels. A reminder that this 8-square-mile speck of volcanic rock sits atop the very fires of creation. Mount Suribachi looms against the lightening sky like a silent sentinel. Its slopes honeycombed with tunnels and gun emplacements, the Japanese engineers have spent 8 months carving from living rock. In concealed positions across the island, 22,000 Japanese defenders peer through steel observation slits, watching as the horizon fills with an armada unlike anything the Pacific has ever seen. 700 American vessels stretch from edge to edge of the visible ocean, their gray hulls cutting through swells that have traveled 4,000 miles from California's coast. The defenders know what approaches. They have prepared for this moment with religious dedication, transforming their island into what they believe is an impregnable fortress of interconnected caves, reinforced bunkers, and hidden artillery positions. The black sand beneath their feet, they are certain, will drink American blood long before it tastes Japanese. This moment represents the collision of two military philosophies that had been evolving throughout the Pacific War. For the Japanese Empire, Iwo Jima embodied the ultimate expression of their defensive doctrine. An island fortress so thoroughly prepared, so cunningly fortified, that it would break the American advance through sheer attrition. The island sat astride the direct route between the Mariana Islands and Japan itself, only 650 miles from Tokyo Bay. Every B-29 superfortress flying from Saipan to bomb the Japanese mainland passed within sight of Iwo Jima's radar installations and fighter bases. For Japan, this volcanic outcropping represented the outer rampart of their homeland defense, the place where American momentum would finally shatter against Japanese resolve. The island's strategic value transcended its modest size. Whoever controlled Iwo Jima controlled the gateway to Japan itself. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the brilliant tactician charged with Iwo Jima's defense, had spent 8 months transforming the island into a subterranean maze of death. Unlike previous Japanese commanders who had relied on beach defenses and banzai charges, Kuribayashi implemented a strategy of defense in depth that would extract maximum casualties from every yard of volcanic soil. His engineers carved 16 miles of tunnels through the island's interior, connecting natural caves with man-made fortifications in a network so extensive that Japanese soldiers could move from one end of the island to the other without ever exposing themselves to American observation. These tunnels, reinforced with steel and concrete, were designed to withstand the heaviest naval bombardment. Gun positions were carved with multiple firing angles and escape routes. Artillery pieces were mounted on rails so they could fire from one position, then disappear into the tunnels before American counter-battery fire could locate them. The Japanese had learned from their defeats at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. No longer would they squander their forces in futile charges across open beaches. Instead, they would make the Americans pay for every pillbox, every cave, every yard of advance. Kuribayashi's orders to his men were uncompromising. Each man will make it his duty to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. The general himself wrote to his wife, "The battle is approaching its climax, and I believe that the enemy will land on this island. When the battle situation becomes inevitable, I will find a place where I can die as a soldier." This was not mere fatalism. It was a calculated strategy to inflict such horrific casualties that the American public would demand an end to the Pacific offensive. For the Americans approaching through the pre-dawn darkness, Iwo Jima represented something equally profound. The island's airfields, once captured and expanded, would provide fighter escort for B-29 bombers attacking Japan, dramatically increasing the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. More immediately, Iwo Jima would serve as an emergency landing field for damaged bombers, returning from raids over the Japanese mainland. American planners estimated that capturing the island would save hundreds of American aircrews who would otherwise be lost over the vast Pacific. The invasion force approaching Iwo Jima on that February morning included 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, totaling more than 70,000 assault troops, supported by the largest naval bombardment force ever assembled in the Pacific. The American battle plan called for a swift, brutal assault that would overwhelm Japanese defenses through superior firepower and maneuver. Intelligence estimates suggested that organized Japanese resistance would collapse within 4 days of the initial landing. The Marines had perfected amphibious assault tactics through 3 years of island warfare, and their confidence in these methods bordered on certainty. They had crushed Japanese defenders on beaches from Guadalcanal to Saipan, and Iwo Jima appeared to offer no new tactical challenges. The volcanic sand might complicate vehicle movement, but American engineering capabilities would quickly overcome such obstacles. The preliminary bombardment had lasted 3 days, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pouring thousands of tons of high explosives onto suspected Japanese positions. Surely, American commanders reasoned, no defensive force could survive such concentrated firepower. As the landing craft approached Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches, Japanese observers noted their methodical precision with growing unease. The Americans had learned their lessons well from previous amphibious assaults. Wave after wave of landing craft moved in perfect formation, their timing synchronized to deliver maximum combat power at the moment of impact. Yet, what the Japanese defenders could not see, hidden in their underground positions, was the scale of American preparation that extended far beyond the visible fleet. Behind the assault waves came an entire floating city of support vessels, hospital ships to treat casualties, repair ships to maintain equipment, supply vessels carrying mountains of ammunition, fuel, and provisions that dwarfed anything the Japanese had imagined possible. The Japanese defenders positioned throughout Iwo Jima's fortifications expected the coming battle to follow familiar patterns. Previous American assaults had relied heavily on preliminary bombardment, followed by rapid advances across open terrain. Japanese commanders anticipated that their hidden positions would allow them to exact a terrible toll on the exposed American infantry, just as they had done at Tarawa and Peleliu. The volcanic terrain of Iwo Jima, with its natural caves and crevices, seemed ideally suited to defensive warfare. Every Japanese soldier knew that retreat was impossible. No ships would come to evacuate them, no reinforcements would arrive to bolster their defense. This knowledge, rather than breaking their morale, seemed to strengthen their resolve. Death in defense of Japanese soil, especially soil so close to the sacred homeland, carried deep spiritual significance. Japanese expectations of American behavior were shaped by 3 years of Pacific combat, during which American forces had consistently demonstrated superior equipment and firepower, but had shown little appetite for prolonged, costly infantry fighting. The Japanese believed that Americans, with their emphasis on material comfort and individual survival, would withdraw rather than accept the casualties that Iwo Jima's defense would inflict. This fundamental misreading of American character and resolve would prove to be one of the most costly intelligence failures of the Pacific War. The Japanese saw American wealth and technological superiority as signs of weakness rather than strength, failing to understand that American industrial abundance freed their military forces to focus entirely on winning rather than merely surviving. At 09:02 hours on February 19th, the first wave of American Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. The volcanic sand that had seemed so solid from a distance proved treacherous underfoot, shifting and sliding as heavily loaded Marines struggled to move inland from the water's edge. The sand was unlike anything American forces had encountered on previous Pacific beaches. Fine, black, and so loose that men sank to their ankles with every step. Equipment bogged down immediately. Tracked vehicles that should have provided fire support found themselves immobilized in the shifting volcanic granules. Yet the expected storm of Japanese defensive fire did not materialize. The beaches, so carefully targeted by American naval gunfire, seemed almost deserted. For 30 precious minutes, American forces poured ashore virtually unopposed. Marines who had steeled themselves for another bloody beach assault began to wonder if the preliminary bombardment had been more effective than anyone had dared hope. Perhaps the Japanese garrison had been destroyed, or perhaps they had withdrawn to more defensible positions inland. The black sand continued to frustrate movement, but American engineering units began laying steel matting and corduroying roads with remarkable efficiency. Within an hour, the beachhead was crowded with men, vehicles, and supplies stacked in neat rows just inland from the surf line. Then Iwo Jima revealed its true nature. At precisely 10:30 hours, the volcanic island erupted in man-made fury. From positions that American observers had sworn were destroyed by naval gunfire, Japanese artillery began a methodical, devastating bombardment of the crowded beaches. Mortar rounds fell with metronomic precision among the stacked supplies and massed personnel. Machine gun fire swept the beach approaches from positions that seemed to materialize from the volcanic rock itself. The Japanese had waited with inhuman patience, allowing the Americans to concentrate their forces in the killing zones that Suribachi had prepared months in advance. The reality that confronted American forces bore no resemblance to their expectations or previous experience. Japanese defenders did not reveal themselves by firing prematurely, nor did they waste their lives in futile banzai charges. Instead, they fought from positions so expertly concealed that American troops could pass within yards without detecting them. A Marine squad would advance past what appeared to be solid rock, only to come under fire from positions they had unknowingly bypassed. The Japanese had created a three-dimensional battlefield in which the Americans held the surface while their enemies controlled the subsurface, emerging to attack and then vanishing back into their volcanic warren. Japanese expectations of easy defensive victories evaporated just as quickly as American hopes for rapid conquest. The Marines advancing from the beaches demonstrated a ferocity and persistence that shocked Japanese observers who had expected Americans to withdraw after suffering modest casualties. Instead of retreating when faced with determined resistance, American units called for close air support, naval gunfire, and flamethrower teams. They advanced yard by yard, using explosives and flame weapons to clear each Japanese position individually. When direct assault failed, they bypassed strongpoints and continued advancing, leaving specialized units to reduce the bypassed positions with methodical thoroughness. The black volcanic sand that had initially hindered American movement began to change color as the battle intensified. The first stains appeared around Japanese positions that had been cleared by flamethrowers and demolition charges. Dark patches spread where wounded Marines had fallen during the initial advance from the beaches. By the end of the first day, scattered red discolorations marked the landscape like an abstract painting drawn in human suffering. The sand that had been completely black at dawn was beginning its transformation into something that would haunt the survivors of both armies for the remainder of their lives. General Suribachi, observing the battle from his command bunker deep beneath the island's surface, began to realize that his defensive strategy, while successful in inflicting casualties, was failing to break American morale as he had anticipated. The Marines continued advancing despite losses that should have shattered any conventional military force. American artillery and naval gunfire demonstrated precision and responsiveness that exceeded Japanese calculations. Most disturbing to Suribachi was the Americans' apparent willingness to accept casualties that Japanese strategists had assumed would be politically unacceptable to a democratic society. By February 23rd, 4 days after the initial landing, American forces had reached the summit of Mount Suribachi, and raised their flag on Iwo Jima's most recognizable terrain feature. The image of 6 Marines raising the stars and stripes would become one of the most famous photographs in military history. But the flag raising represented only the beginning of the island's agony, not its end. Suribachi had concentrated his main defensive positions in the island's northern sector, where the volcanic terrain was most favorable to defense. The fighting that would consume the next 32 days would make the assault on Suribachi seem like a preliminary skirmish. The statistical reality of Iwo Jima's carnage defied contemporary understanding of what human beings could endure and inflict upon each other. Over 36 days of continuous combat, American forces suffered 26,000 casualties, including 6,800 dead and 19,200 wounded, a casualty rate of more than 35% among the assault forces. These numbers represented the highest casualty rate of any American amphibious assault in the Pacific War, exceeding even the bloody beaches of Normandy in terms of casualties per day of fighting. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 300 would survive the battle. The remainder died in their tunnels, at their gun positions, or in the final desperate charges that marked the end of organized resistance. Marine Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, who threw himself on 2 Japanese grenades to save his fellow Marines, survived wounds that should have been fatal and received the Medal of Honor at age 17. His action typified the individual heroism that the battle demanded from ordinary American soldiers faced with extraordinary circumstances. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than for any other single battle in American history. The medal citations read like excerpts from ancient epics. Men who charged machine gun nests single-handed, who continued fighting despite wounds that would have incapacitated normal individuals, who sacrificed themselves to save comrades they had known for months, or sometimes only days. Japanese resistance demonstrated equal measures of courage and futility. Colonel Takechi Nishi, the famous Olympic equestrian who commanded Japanese tank forces on Iwo Jima, fought until his positions were overrun, then committed suicide rather than surrender. His final radio message to General Suribachi reported that his tanks had been destroyed and his men were fighting as infantry with small arms and grenades. Captain Samaji Inoue led the final organized Banzai charge on March 25th, leading 300 survivors against American positions near the island's northern coast. Every man in the charge died, but they inflicted sufficient casualties to remind the Americans that Japanese resistance remained unbroken, even in defeat. The volcanic sand that had initially appeared as an obstacle became the silent witness to transformations that neither army had anticipated. Where Marines had died clearing Japanese bunkers, the sand absorbed American blood that mixed with volcanic minerals in combinations that seemed to glow darkly in the tropical sunlight. Where Japanese defenders had made their final stands, explosions and flamethrowers had fused sand and flesh into glass-like formations that would remain visible decades after the battle ended. The island itself became a massive cemetery where the sand served as both shroud and monument to the men who had fallen. American perceptions of Japanese military capabilities underwent fundamental revision during the 36 days of fighting. Previous battles had demonstrated Japanese courage and tactical skill, but Iwo Jima revealed strategic and engineering capabilities that American intelligence had consistently underestimated. The tunnel systems proved nearly impervious to conventional bombardment, requiring the development of new tactics and weapons specifically designed for underground warfare. Flamethrower teams became the primary assault weapon, supported by demolition charges and close-range artillery fire that could be delivered with surgical precision. The transformation of American tactical doctrine during the battle reflected adaptation under the most extreme combat conditions. Marines learned to fight in 3 dimensions simultaneously, clearing surface positions while remaining alert for attacks from below, above, and behind. Standard infantry tactics proved inadequate against an enemy that could appear anywhere and disappear into solid rock. American units developed new techniques for clearing tunnels, using combinations of explosives, poison gas, and flame weapons that would have been considered excessive in any previous conflict. Japanese tactical evolution during the battle revealed both the strengths and limitations of defensive warfare, carried to its logical extreme. Kuribayashi's strategy of trading space for casualties succeeded in inflicting unprecedented losses on American forces, but it could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources and reinforcements. Every Japanese casualty was irreplaceable, while American losses, however painful, could be made good by the vast reservoir of trained personnel available in the Pacific theater. The mathematics of attrition warfare, when carried out over 36 days, inevitably favored the side with superior logistics and reinforcement capabilities. The red staining of Iwo Jima's volcanic sand became a recurring image in the letters and diaries of survivors from both armies. Marine Private Robert Leckie wrote to his family that the sand had become red as Kansas wheat fields in autumn. But the harvest here was measured in lives rather than grain. Japanese Sergeant Taro Kurata, in his final diary entry before the position was overrun, described the sand around his bunker as drinking the blood of heroes from both armies, becoming sacred ground that future generations must remember. These personal accounts capture the profound psychological impact of fighting in an environment where the very ground beneath their feet had been transformed by human sacrifice. The symbolic power of Iwo Jima's red sand extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For Americans, the island became proof that democratic societies could sustain casualties in defense of principles that transcended immediate material interests. The willingness of American forces to continue fighting, despite losses that exceeded those of many European battles, demonstrated that democracy did not necessarily breed softness or reluctance to sacrifice. For the Japanese, Iwo Jima proved that American industrial superiority could not be overcome by courage and tactical skill alone, no matter how expertly applied. General Kuribayashi's final radio message to Tokyo, transmitted on March 23rd as American forces closed in on his command bunker, acknowledged the transformation that Iwo Jima had wrought in Japanese strategic thinking. The enemy has demonstrated capabilities in sustained offensive operations that exceed our previous calculations. Their willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives indicates a level of national commitment that our intelligence services failed to anticipate. Kuribayashi died 3 days later, leading a final attack against American positions near the island's northern shore. His body was never found, but American Marines reported that the attack was conducted with such precision and coordination that it seemed more like a military demonstration than a desperate last stand. The medical statistics from Iwo Jima reveal the battle's unprecedented intensity and duration. American hospital ships anchored offshore treated casualties at rates that exceeded their designed capacity by more than 300%. Psychiatric casualties, officially termed combat fatigue, occurred at rates never before documented in American military history. The average Marine rifleman who survived the entire 36-day battle had witnessed the death or wounding of 60% of his original unit. Many veterans would later describe Iwo Jima as existing in a separate category from other combat experiences, a place where normal human limitations had been suspended by necessity and circumstance. Japanese medical resources, limited from the beginning of the battle, became virtually non-existent after the first week of fighting. Wounded Japanese soldiers died in their tunnels for lack of medical supplies that American forces possessed in abundance. This disparity in medical care reflected the broader resource gap that ultimately determined the battle's outcome, but it also highlighted the different cultural approaches to casualty care and individual survival. American forces evacuated wounded personnel whenever possible, while Japanese wounded were expected to continue fighting until death or to commit suicide rather than burden their comrades. The engineering achievements on both sides of the Iwo Jima battle represented military construction on an unprecedented scale. Japanese tunnel systems, carved from solid volcanic rock with hand tools and minimal mechanical equipment, demonstrated what could be accomplished through human labor directed by skilled engineering and unlimited time. American construction efforts, concentrated on airfield expansion and port facilities, showed how advanced mechanical equipment could transform terrain at speeds that seemed impossible to Japanese observers. These competing demonstrations of engineering capability reflected the broader industrial and technological competition that underlay the Pacific War. Weather conditions during the battle added another dimension to the suffering endured by both armies. Iwo Jima's climate, dominated by sulfurous vapors from underground volcanic activity, created respiratory problems that affected all personnel regardless of nationality. The volcanic sand, when disturbed by explosions and vehicle movement, created dust clouds that reduced visibility to a few yards and infiltrated every piece of equipment and clothing. Rain, when it came, mixed with volcanic ash and human blood to create a slurry that made movement even more difficult and added to the surreal appearance of the battlefield. The transformation of Iwo Jima's landscape during 36 days of fighting left the island virtually unrecognizable from its pre-battle appearance. Aerial photographs taken before and after the fighting show an 8-square-mile moonscape where virtually every natural feature had been obliterated by explosives, fire, and earth-moving equipment. The black volcanic sand that had covered the island before the battle was churned into a red-brown mixture that would remain visible for decades after the fighting ended. Mount Suribachi, honeycombed with Japanese tunnels and bunkers, required months of explosive demolition to make it safe for American use. American casualties during the final week of fighting reached levels that would have been considered unsustainable in any previous conflict. The 5th Marine Division, which had landed with full strength on February 19th, reported effective strength of less than 40% by March 20th. Yet these depleted units continued attacking with a persistence that amazed both enemy observers and their own officers. This performance under extreme conditions demonstrated how citizen soldiers could achieve military effectiveness that exceeded professional armies when fighting for causes they considered essential to their national survival. The Japanese defense of Iwo Jima's northern sector demonstrated tactical innovation under impossible circumstances. Cut off from supply and reinforcement, Japanese units developed new methods for conserving ammunition, sharing weapons, and coordinating attacks between isolated positions. These tactical adaptations, while ultimately futile, showed how professional military forces could maintain effectiveness even when facing certain annihilation. The techniques developed by Japanese defenders during the final weeks of fighting would be studied by military analysts for decades after the war ended. Communication between American units on Iwo Jima required innovations that reflected the unique challenges of the volcanic battlefield. Standard radio equipment often failed due to electronic interference from volcanic minerals and the proximity of metallic objects embedded in the island's fortifications. American forces developed relay systems using visual signals, runners, and primitive telephone networks that could function in the electromagnetic chaos of the battlefield. These communication innovations, developed under combat conditions, would influence military communication doctrine throughout the Cold War period. The role of naval gunfire support during the Iwo Jima battle established new standards for precision and responsiveness in amphibious warfare. American destroyers stationed close inshore provided fire support with accuracy measured in yards, rather than hundreds of yards, often engaging targets that were barely visible to observers on the beach. This level of precision required new techniques for target identification and fire control that pushed existing technology to its absolute limits. Japanese observers, watching American naval gunfire eliminate their carefully concealed positions with surgical precision, began to understand the true extent of American technological and industrial superiority. Air support operations over Iwo Jima demonstrated the effectiveness of close air support when conducted with unlimited resources and minimal concern for equipment losses. American pilots flew multiple sorties per day, attacking targets that were often within 50 yards of friendly forces. This level of precision and risk acceptance was possible only because American industrial production could replace aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. Japanese forces, who had expected American airmen to avoid risks that might result in aircraft losses, watched in amazement as American pilots pressed attacks at altitudes and distances that seemed suicidal. The logistical achievements that sustained American forces on Iwo Jima required supply operations on a scale that exceeded anything previously attempted in amphibious warfare. Over 36 days of fighting, American forces consumed more than 100,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies, all of which had to be transported across 4,000 miles of Pacific Ocean and then moved from ship to shore across beaches that remained under Japanese artillery fire throughout the battle. This logistical performance demonstrated American industrial and transportation capabilities that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated throughout the Pacific. War. Food and water supply on Iwo Jima revealed the contrasts between American abundance and Japanese scarcity that characterized the entire Pacific conflict. American forces received hot meals and fresh water throughout the battle, delivered to forward positions by supply units that operated under fire with routine efficiency. Japanese defenders, cut off from resupply after the first day of fighting, survived on rice balls and contaminated water drawn from volcanic springs. This disparity in basic necessities reflected the broader resource gap that ultimately determined not only the outcome of individual battles, but the war's final result. Medical evacuation procedures developed during the Iwo Jima battle established standards for battlefield medicine that would influence military medical doctrine for decades. American forces pioneered helicopter evacuation techniques, blood transfusion procedures, and field surgery methods under conditions that would have been considered impossible in previous conflicts. The survival rate among American wounded on Iwo Jima exceeded 90%, a medical achievement that was possible only through the combination of advanced medical training, unlimited supplies, and rapid evacuation procedures that Japanese forces could not match. The psychological impact of Iwo Jima on Japanese strategic planning became evident in intercepted communications during the final week of fighting. Tokyo acknowledged that American casualties, while severe, had not resulted in the political pressure to end the offensive that Japanese planners had anticipated. Instead, American forces demonstrated increasing tactical proficiency and maintained offensive momentum despite losses that should have forced an operational pause. This recognition forced fundamental revisions in Japanese expectations about American resolve and capabilities that would influence all subsequent strategic planning. Intelligence operations during the Iwo Jima battle revealed the limitations of both American and Japanese intelligence capabilities when confronted with unprecedented tactical situations. American intelligence had failed to detect the full extent of Japanese tunnel systems, while Japanese intelligence had underestimated American willingness to sustain casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. These intelligence failures resulted in tactical surprises for both sides that prolonged the battle and increased casualties beyond all pre-battle estimates. The evolution of infantry tactics during the 36 days of fighting transformed American combat doctrine in ways that would influence military operations throughout the Cold War period. Marines developed new techniques for bunker assault, tunnel clearing, and urban warfare that became standard throughout the American military. These tactical innovations, learned at enormous cost in human life, represented advances in military effectiveness that could not have been achieved through peacetime training or theoretical study. Weather's impact on the battle extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to affect the morale and physical condition of troops from both armies. The sulfurous atmosphere caused respiratory problems that reduced combat effectiveness and complicated medical treatment. Volcanic dust infiltrated weapons and equipment, causing malfunctions that occurred at critical moments during combat operations. These environmental challenges affected both armies equally, creating a shared experience of suffering that transcended national and cultural differences. By March 26, 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima had effectively ended, though isolated pockets of defenders continued fighting from caves and tunnels for several more weeks. The island that Japanese commanders had believed would take months for American forces to capture had fallen in 36 days, but at a cost that shocked military planners on both sides. The volcanic sand that had been completely black on February 19th was now permanently stained with the blood of more than 28,000 casualties from both armies. American engineers began the immediate task of expanding Iwo Jima's airfields to accommodate B-29 operations, but the red sand beneath their bulldozers served as a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for this strategic position. The first B-29 to make an emergency landing on Iwo Jima touched down on March 4th, while fighting was still raging in the island's northern sector. Over the following months, more than 2,400 damaged American bombers would use Iwo Jima's airfields, saving an estimated 27,000 aircrews who would otherwise have been lost over the Pacific. This practical vindication of the strategic decision to assault Iwo Jima provided some consolation for the enormous casualties, but it could never fully justify the human cost in the minds of those who had witnessed the battle's reality. The red volcanic sand of Iwo Jima became a symbol that transcended its immediate military significance. For American forces, the island represented proof that democratic societies could sustain casualties in defense of principles that extended beyond immediate material interests. The Marines who had died on Iwo Jima had not been fighting for conquest or plunder, but for strategic positions that would save lives and hasten the end of a war they had not chosen to start. For Japanese defenders, the red sand represented the ultimate expression of Bushido, death in defense of sacred soil that lay within sight of their homeland. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the strategic bombing offensive against Japan, wrote in his post-war memoirs that Iwo Jima had saved more American lives than any other single military operation of the Pacific War. The island's airfields served as bases for fighter escorts that reduced bomber losses over Japan by more than 70%. Emergency landing facilities on Iwo Jima provided alternatives for damaged aircraft that would otherwise have attempted ditching in the Pacific with minimal survival chances. These strategic benefits, measurable in thousands of lives saved, provided the mathematical justification for the battle's enormous cost. The Japanese government's official history of the Pacific War, published in 1956, acknowledged that Iwo Jima marked the point at which Japanese strategic planning had to accept the inevitability of defeat. The battle had demonstrated American capabilities in sustained offensive operations that exceeded all Japanese calculations. More significantly, it had proven that American industrial superiority could support casualty rates that Japanese planners had believed would be politically unacceptable in a democratic society. This recognition forced revisions in Japanese strategy that ultimately led to surrender negotiations rather than continued resistance. Survivors from both armies would carry the memory of Iwo Jima's red sand for the remainder of their lives. American veterans described dreams in which the volcanic sand moved and shifted beneath their feet, stained with blood that never dried or washed away. Japanese survivors, the handful who were captured rather than killed, spoke of the island as a place where the boundary between earth and blood had been erased, where the ground itself had become sacred through the magnitude of sacrifice it had witnessed. The transformation of Iwo Jima from a strategic objective into a symbol of sacrifice reflected changes in American society that extended far beyond military affairs. The battle demonstrated that citizen soldiers, drawn from democratic society and trained for civilian occupations, could achieve military performance that equaled or exceeded professional armies when fighting for causes they considered essential. This revelation influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War, supporting arguments for citizen-based military service rather than professional standing armies. In the broader context of World War II, Iwo Jima represented the moment when American military power reached its full expression in the Pacific theater. The battle combined industrial abundance, technological superiority, and individual courage in proportions that overwhelmed even the most skilled and determined opposition. The red sand of Iwo Jima absorbed the blood of the last Japanese army that believed superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, marking the end of an era in military history when courage and tactical skill could compensate for industrial inferiority. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, transformed from black to red over 36 days of unimaginable violence, remains today as silent testimony to truths about human nature that transcend national boundaries and historical periods. The staining of that sand represents the price that free societies must sometimes pay to preserve their freedoms, measured not in treasure or territory, but in the irreplaceable lives of those who choose sacrifice over surrender. The Marines who died advancing across that red sand were not professional soldiers fighting for pay or glory, but citizens defending principles they had inherited from previous generations and hoped to pass to their children. The Japanese defenders who died in their tunnels and bunkers, fighting to the last man for an island they knew they could not hold, demonstrated that honor and duty can inspire extraordinary sacrifice even in hopeless causes. Their resistance, while ultimately futile, established standards of military professionalism and personal courage that commanded respect even from their enemies. The red sand that covered their bodies represents the tragedy of war itself, the waste of human potential, and the destruction of lives that might have contributed to human progress if channeled toward peaceful pursuits. Today, more than 7 decades after the last shot was fired on Iwo Jima, the island's volcanic sand has returned to its original black color. Wind and weather have covered the stains of 1945, and vegetation has grown over the scars left by explosives and flame weapons. Yet, the transformation that occurred during those 36 days in early 1945 remains embedded in the island's identity and in the memory of those who understand what happened there. Iwo Jima stands as proof that democracy, when threatened with extinction, can summon reserves of strength and sacrifice that equal or exceed those of any totalitarian system. The red sand of Iwo Jima teaches us that freedom is not a natural condition, but an artificial creation that must be continuously defended by each generation. The Marines who died there understood, perhaps better than their contemporaries who remained at home, that democracy's greatest strength lies not in its material abundance or technological superiority, but in its ability to inspire ordinary citizens to accept extraordinary sacrifice in defense of principles that extend beyond their immediate self-interest. The volcanic sand that drank their blood became sacred ground, not because of its strategic importance, but because of the human choice to value freedom above life itself. In the end, the transformation of Iwo Jima's sand from black to red and back to black again reminds us that the most important battles are not fought for territory or resources, but for ideas and principles that give meaning to human existence. The 36 days of fighting on that 8-square-mile volcanic island established that democratic societies, when faced with existential threats, can demonstrate resolve and sacrifice that equals or exceeds that of any totalitarian regime. The red sand bears witness to the truth that freedom's price is always paid in blood, but that this price, however terrible, is never too high when measured against the alternative of slavery and oppression.